It seems there's more talk in the Senate now of this going through regular order. Do you support that, or will regular order kill this effort?
Well, let's first of all remember why this is important. And I've been on this issue for over a year, and with all due respect to the TikTok management, when I had a bipartisan bill, they made incredible number of false claims about the bill. They tried to make the same false claims about the effort in the House. And frankly, their heavy-handed tactics totally backfired. They got 352 members of the House of Representatives to vote for a divestiture of TikTok. I don't want TikTok to go away. I agree there's a lot of creativity. But I don't want, at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party, because Chinese law as of 2017 says every company has to be first and foremost not loyal to customers or shareholders, but to the Communist Party. And they pose a national security risk for two reasons. One, they're collecting enormous amount of personal data about Americans. The genius of TikTok, it kind of knows what you like even before you may know. And that kind of personal data, the 170 million Americans who are on 90 minutes a day, if you don't think that is a security risk, or potentially you could be blackmailed at some future time by agents of the Chinese government, then I think you don't understand the unfortunate real world that we live in. So data protection is key. The other half of this is the ability for TikTok to slightly shift that algorithm and affect the news. I mean, half of the young people on TikTok get almost all their news from TikTok. So it would not surprise me at all if the Communist Party says, as it gets closer to election in America, if there's not a disgorgement, hey, China ought to be able to take over Taiwan with no problem. Or Vladimir Putin, we ought to give him Ukraine. Completely anti-American interest, driven by frankly, a country's leadership who is clearly viewed and is an adversary of the United States. We would never allow a Chinese company to come in and buy Bloomberg, buy Fox, buy MSNBC, and then produce news for Americans. We'd say that's crazy. Well, that's unfortunately what's happening now.
Okay, so Senators, clearly you see great risk with the operation of this platform and the ownership of ByteDance, considering the China factor here. Given that, do you think that this deserves to be expedited, to not go through regular order? Is that how you would like to see this approached in your chamber?
I absolutely would like to see it expedited. And, I've started conversations with the chairman of the Commerce Committee, Senator Cantwell, and again, she doesn't need convincing. She has legislation as well on this topic. I know, Senator Schumer, this all just happened yesterday, so Senator Schumer's not laid out clearly all his plans, but I know he's raised concerns as well. So I think we need to get this done. And what again we need to make clear is nobody's talking about a ban. We're talking about transferring the ownership and the algorithm to some other control that's not Chinese.
Well, and doing so in a relatively short period of time, Senator, the time frame is 6 months. Do you realistically think not only a buyer can be found, but a deal be completed and China sign off on it in that amount of time?
Well, that's one of the areas that might need a little more stretch. But we've already seen in the news today, I think you guys have been reporting, that former Trump Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, who is frankly one of the first people that educate me about this issue, is trying to put together an investor group to buy ByteDance/TikTok. I think there will be others. I think, the question will be, will the Chinese government allow it to be sold, because they would lose this data collection tool and this propaganda tool that I think is for their purposes, even more valuable than the value of the company.
And of course, a lot of this does come down to national security considerations. And it seems, sir, that a lot is coming down to national security considerations these days, including potentially U.S. steel being bought by a Japanese company, Japan, a very close ally to the United States. And yes, CFIUS is looking into this deal. President Biden now put out a statement suggesting that U.S. steel should stay in American hands. But, sir, is that really about national security, or is it just the fact that it's an election year and there's politics at play?
Listen, I think there is a difference between nations like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea that are in our law defined as adversaries, and countries like Japan that, as you said, is a close ally. I haven't followed all the ins and outs, but I understood that the Nippon Steel that was going to try to acquire U.S. Steel was going to guarantee American jobs, guarantee the labor contracts, but I've not really dug into this at the level to offer a full-fledged opinion. I do think, though, I believe that in a trading environment where we ought to do business with our friends and allies around the world.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask you, sir, about another ally, Israel. Your majority leader, Chuck Schumer, on the floor today suggested that there needs to be a new election in Israel, that perhaps Netanyahu should no longer be in the job that he is in. Is it appropriate for one of the highest ranking members of the U.S. government to be making such suggestions about a Democratic ally?
Well, first of all, I am been a lifelong supporter of Israel. But I worry. I worry the way Prime Minister Netanyahu is conducting this war with 30,000 now dead Palestinians, with inability to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, with, frankly, some of the settler violence in the West Bank, that we could be losing a generation, particularly of young Americans, who are never going to be supportive of Israel. And I don't think that's in Israel's long-term interest. I'm not going to tell Israel who they should have as leader, but I would point out Prime Minister Netanyahu was never shy about interfering in American politics. If you remember how he at every turn tried to thwart President Obama when he was president, and if you've seen the way he is, even since October 7th, particularly treated our Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, it's not been the way a treatment would be of a country like Israel's strongest, most fervent, and frankly, at this point, maybe sole remaining major ally in the world.
President Biden in recent days had suggested in an interview that if Israel were to proceed with an invasion of Rafah, that could potentially cross a red line. What consequence, what recourse would the United States have if Israel were to go ahead and conduct that operation despite warnings from this administration?
Well, first of all, the United States is, and Bill Burns, the CIA director, has been absolutely leading the effort to try to get the hostages released and a ceasefire, a pause, and that's what we ought to be aiming for, and I think much of the Israeli government supports that. The idea that you're going to go into this community of 1.5 million people now, where people have been literally bunched together with no ability for those Palestinians to have any kind of safety, you could have this conflict that's just been in Gaza spread to Lebanon, spread to Jordan, spread to the West Bank. That's not in America's interest. I don't even think it's obviously not in Israel's interest, because if the United States ends up saying we are going to restrict some of our aid because you have taken this very aggressive action and suddenly Israel's fighting on a multi-front war, I think that would be a disaster for Israel.
And finally, Senator, I'd like to ask you specifically about aid to another U.S. ally, Ukraine. Just in the last several days here at Bloomberg, we've spoken with the Prime Minister of Latvia, with the President of Poland, both of which expressed real dire consequence if Ukraine does not get the support it needs and potentially loses the war to Russia. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul said today he's working on a path forward for that aid in the House. He said one way to pay for it that's increasingly popular among Republicans is seizing hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign Russian assets to pay for it. If it gets the aid to Ukraine, Senator, would you support that effort?
You guys are Bloomberg News. You know that even if we were to pass a law and the vast majority of this Russian assets are in Europe, it will take years of litigation. Anybody that says that's going to get them the $60 billion they need yesterday, and I think Mike McCaul understands that, that could be part of a process, but that is not going to relieve the need. And I can't think of an issue that is of more historic proportions than supporting the Ukrainians at this moment. The Ukrainians, with a little bit of help from us, less than 3% of our defense budget 2 years running, have destroyed 87% of Russia's pre-existing ground forces, 63% of their tanks, 32% of their armored personnel carriers, without the loss of a single American life. What the folks you had from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland on, if Putin wins in Ukraine, they will be next. And American soldiers could be in harm's way and in conflict within a couple years. That would be a disaster. And it would be a disaster that would be laid at the feet of this Speaker of the House, who hasn't brought this bill up. There are 300 votes plus for Ukraine in the House. Let the House express its will. There were 70 votes in the Senate. If we walk away from this obligation, I think most countries will never trust us again. And that will be a mistake of historic proportions. Those who make comparisons to what happened with appeasement before World War II in terms of Hitler are not far off from this level of importance of this decision.